You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail. And it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
As the water levels dropped in Lake Tahoe, divers found something terrifying at the bottom of America's clearest lake. The 2024 drought, the worst in 1,200 years, pulled the waterline down 9 feet and exposed things along the shore that nobody was supposed to see.
Yeah, because Lake Tahoe is so big, the level moves up and down a lot more slowly than lakes like Folsom and Shasta. But now Tahoe is already at its lowest level in 4 years, and it's still headed down.
The remotely operated vehicles recorded at 1,600 foot down is worse, far worse. Not a creature, not a shipwreck, not the Tahoe Tessie legend the locals have whispered about since the 1800s. Something older, something quieter, and once you see it, Lake Tahoe is ruined for you forever. The lake built to hide things. To understand what those ROVs found in the dark, you have to understand why Lake Tahoe became the perfect place on Earth to hide things that were never meant to be found. Lake Tahoe sits at 6,225 feet of elevation, straddling the border between California and Nevada. It is the largest alpine lake in North America, the second deepest lake in the United States. Only Oregon's Crater Lake goes deeper. The basin was formed by geological faulting millions of years ago, creating a nearly vertical wall trench that plunges 1,645 feet into the earth. Cold enough to kill a swimmer in 20 minutes. Clear enough that from the surface you can see 70 foot down through water that has never warmed above 42 degrees. The water is so clear because almost nothing lives in it. The granite basin contributes almost no nutrients. The cold inhibits biological activity. Tahoe's waters are nearly sterile, and that sterility is exactly what makes the lake famous. It is what draws millions of tourists every year, and it is what would make any contamination immediately, visibly, catastrophically obvious. Or at least it would be obvious if the contamination were near the surface. But here is the thing nobody puts in the brochures. Drop something past 1,500 feet in Lake Tahoe, and you are not really dropping it into water anymore. So the water at the bottom of the lake circles to the surface. This typically happens every 4 to 7 you are dropping it into a refrigerator the size of a city. Locked from the outside with no key. The cold halts decay. The pressure pins gases in solution so they cannot bubble up and give the contents away. The dark prevents any light-driven chemistry that might break things down. Whatever sinks down there enters a kind of suspended animation. And it stays that way for decades, for lifetimes, for 70 years and counting. That is what Lake Tahoe really is. Not a wilderness, a vault. The boom that buried it all. The story begins in the 1940s and 1950s. Before World War II, Tahoe was hard to reach. The roads were treacherous, often impassable in winter. A few lodges catered to wealthy tourists, but the lake remained largely wild. The war changed everything. Military training facilities were established in the region. Roads were improved for logistics. Soldiers stationed nearby discovered the area's beauty. And after the war, when those soldiers came home with money to spend and cars to drive, they remembered Lake Tahoe. The boom hit in the late 1940s and accelerated through the 1950s. Casinos opened on the Nevada side where gambling was legal. Resorts and hotels multiplied. Summer cabins became year-round homes. This transformation happened fast, faster than regulations could keep up with, faster than anyone was thinking about consequences. And here is the catch. The boom generated waste, enormous quantities of waste, construction debris from the hundreds of buildings going up, sewage from the growing population, industrial chemicals from the businesses servicing the casinos, old equipment, old vehicles, old everything that needed to go somewhere. In the 1950s, environmental regulations barely existed. The concept of hazardous waste disposal was in its infancy, and Lake Tahoe was right there, vast, deep, seemingly bottomless. Why pay to truck waste over the mountains when you could dump it in the lake at night? The practice was open enough that locals knew, but hidden enough that tourists did not. Construction crews disposed of debris directly into the water. Businesses dumped chemicals that would later be classified as toxic. Old cars were pushed off cliffs into the depths below, sometimes with their tanks still full of gasoline and oil. Lakes across America were used as dumping grounds in this era. What made Tahoe different was the scale, the depth, and the peculiar chemistry that preserved every single bit of it. When the environmental movement gained strength in the 1960s and 1970s, some of the visible dumping stopped. Regulations were passed. Monitoring began. The Lake Tahoe Basin became the subject of intense environmental attention precisely because its clarity made changes so visible. But nobody went to the bottom. The cost was prohibitive. The technology barely existed. And frankly, nobody wanted to know what was down there. The lake looked clean. The surface stayed clear. Whatever had been dumped in the 1950s had sunk out of sight. And out of sight meant out of mind. For 70 years, that calculation held. Then came the drought. What the shore revealed. The 2024 drought was the culmination of years of below-average precipitation. Snowpack in the Sierra Nevada dropped to record lows. The streams feeding Lake Tahoe slowed to trickles. Evaporation exceeded inflow, and the lake level dropped. 9 feet does not sound like much for a lake 1,645 feet deep, but the drop happened at the shoreline, and as the water receded, it exposed things that had been underwater for decades. The first reports came from hikers walking newly exposed stretches of beach. Tires, bottles, unidentifiable metal objects corroded beyond recognition. Easy to dismiss as ordinary litter. Then the divers showed up. Colin West is the founder of Clean Up the Lake, a Tahoe nonprofit that has spent years scuba diving the lake's perimeter and hauling out trash. Here's 72 miles and more than 20,000 pieces of trash later, the Clean Up the Lake effort in Lake Tahoe is preparing to embark on their final mission. What a huge mission it was. Joining us now to talk about this final dive is the founder and the executive director of Clean Up the Lake, Colin West. Thank you for being with us, Colin. We appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me, Ty. I appreciate it. By summer 2024, his teams were operating in shallows that had been inaccessible for generations. And what they were finding had stopped being trash. They were finding cars, dozens of them. Cars from the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. Some appeared to have been driven deliberately into the water. Others had been pushed or towed in, scattered across the lake bed, concentrated near old roads and access points. The condition of the vehicles was the part that put hairs up. The cold water had prevented the corrosion that destroys submerged cars in other environments. Paint was still visible on some. Interior features remained recognizable, as if the cars had been driven in yesterday and were simply waiting to be retrieved. West has described pulling onto sites where his dive lights hit a 1957 sedan, and his first instinct was to check whether someone was still inside. Think about that for a second. A diver in 2024 swimming up to a vehicle that has been on the bottom since Eisenhower was in the White House and reflexively looking through the driver's side window, the way you would at a wreck on the highway. That is how preserved these cars are. The doors still have door handles. The dashboards still have dashboards. The license plates on a few are still readable. One of them traces back to a registration that was never reported stolen. The car simply went into the lake and the paperwork went into a drawer, and nobody asked any further questions for half a century. But cars were not the disturbing part. Old vehicles in lakes are common. What was disturbing was what the cars were sitting on top of. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the kind where the bottom of the lake has been keeping a secret longer than most people watching this have been alive, do me a favor and hit subscribe. We dig into the histories powerful people would rather stayed buried, and there is a lot more coming. Now, back to what was underneath those cars, what the ROV has found. The Clean Up the Lake teams had been sharing data with researchers at UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, the institution that has been monitoring the lake's water clarity since 1968. As the survey expanded into deeper water, the operation outgrew what scuba divers could safely do. So they brought in the robots, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs equipped with lights, high-definition cameras, sample arms, and tethers long enough to reach the basin floor. The footage from intermediate depths, 200 to 500 feet, showed more of the same. More vehicles, more debris, more evidence of decades of casual dumping. Then they went deeper. Below 1,000 feet, the ROV cameras entered a different world. The last traces of sunlight disappeared. The temperature dropped to the low 40s and stayed there. The pressure increased to levels that would crush an unprotected human body, and the debris kept coming. At 1,400 feet, the ROV's lights illuminated something the team initially could not identify. Large cylindrical objects, dozens of them, scattered across the lake bed. Barrels, industrial drums, the kind used to store and transport chemicals. This is the moment Colin West has described in interviews as the one he cannot shake. He is in a heated cabin on a research boat, drinking coffee, watching a screen. And the screen is showing him what looks like a graveyard. Row after row of corroded metal cylinders sitting in the dark exactly where someone left them. Some still bearing visible markings, manufacturer logos, chemical codes, handling music instructions. And here is what gets you. The ROV's lights only reach so far. So you see a barrel, then two, then a cluster of six, then the operator turns the camera and there are more behind those, and more behind those, fading out into the black water beyond the lights. You do not see the end of the field. You just see that the field keeps going, and you start music to understand that the number of barrels down there is not measured in dozens. It is measured in hundreds. He knew immediately what he was looking at. Industrial drums do not end up at 1,000 1,400 feet by accident. They do not roll down hills into the water. They do not fall off boats. Someone transported them to the lake and dumped them deliberately in water deep enough that no one would ever find them. A music, or so they thought. The ROV surveyed the field for hours, documenting hundreds of containers. The distribution pattern suggested multiple dumping events over an extended period. Some had been dropped in clusters, others scattered individually. A music, some had been full when dumped, others had drifted before coming to rest. But the most disturbing discovery came at 1,600 feet near the maximum depth of the ROV's operational range. The barrels there were different, larger, more heavily constructed, and they were not just corroded, they were leaking. The water was never clean. The cameras captured plumes of material seeping from ruptured containers. In the cold, still water, these plumes did not disperse quickly. They hung in the water column, visible clouds of whatever had been stored in those drums, slowly diffusing into the surrounding environment. The team ordered water samples taken as close to the leaking containers as the ROVs could safely approach. The samples were sent to the labs at UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. Dr. Jeffrey Schladow, the center's longtime director, has been studying Lake Tahoe for over 2 decades. He has watched the lake's clarity decline by feet over the years. He has published the data. He has testified at public meetings, but the results that came back from the deep barrel samples were of a different category entirely. Heavy metals, lead at concentrations hundreds of times higher than safe levels, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, industrial solvents that had been banned for decades, chemical compounds that modern regulations classify as hazardous waste requiring specialized disposal. The barrels contain the toxic byproducts of mid-20th century industry, dumped in Lake Tahoe because someone calculated that the cost of proper disposal was not worth it. And the lake was deep enough that no one would ever know. That calculation was wrong. It just took 70 years to prove it. Schladow's team pieced together a likely timeline. The heaviest dumping appears to have occurred between 1948 and 1965. This corresponds to the casino development boom on the Nevada side and the broader post-war construction surge. The chemicals are consistent with industries active in the region during that period. Metal processing, automotive services, dry cleaning, industrial laundry facilities serving the hotels and casinos, photography processing labs, paint and coating manufacturers. All of these operations generate hazardous waste. In the 1950s, disposing of it properly was expensive and in many cases legally unnecessary. So they dumped it in the lake. The logic was simple. Lake Tahoe was deep, impossibly deep by normal standards. Music, whatever went down, would not come back up. The cold would slow decomposition. The depth would prevent anyone from seeing what was on the bottom. And the lack of mixing between deep and surface waters would keep the contamination isolated. For decades, this logic held. Water quality monitoring focused on the surface. The deep lake was assumed to be pristine because nobody could check. But containment is not permanent. Metal corrodes even in cold water. Seals fail. Contents leak. And here is where Schladow's data turned the story inside out. His samples found trace amounts of heavy metals at shallower depths than they had any business reaching. The contamination has been spreading for years, slowly, quietly, migrating up through the water column toward the layers people swim in, fish in, and then pull drinking water from. Think about what that actually means in your daily life. A family rents a cabin on the South Shore for a week in July. The kids jump off the dock. Somebody fills a water bottle from the tap. Somebody else grills the trout they caught that morning. Every one of those interactions is downstream of a barrel that was dumped before any of them were born. Lead does not break down. Mercury does not break down. Arsenic does not break down. Whatever was in those drums is still in those drums. And the small fraction that has escaped is no longer down at 1,600 feet. It is on the move. The pristine waters of Lake Tahoe are not pristine. They have not been for decades. The contamination has just been too deep and too dispersed to detect with standard monitoring until now. But the barrels are not the only thing the ROVs found. This is where the story takes a darker turn. What they will not tell us. Among the debris documented by the ROV surveys were objects that did not fit the industrial dumping pattern. Personal items, luggage, clothing remnants preserved by the cold. And in several locations, what the operators on the boat described as forms that should not be there. Lake Tahoe has a dark history that the tourism boards do not advertise. During the casino era, organized crime had a significant presence in the region. The Tahoe-Reno corridor was disputed territory between various criminal organizations. Disputes were
talked about it in some of our NorCal legends before about are there frozen bodies at the bottom of Lake Tahoe, and as we've talked about previously, if there are, which there is no proof of, but you can see a lake of that depth and that cold of an area that potentially mummifying or preserving dead bodies would have been mob-related.
That the lake contains victims of mob violence, dumped in deep water where they would never be found. The cold temperatures that prevent normal decomposition were said to preserve them indefinitely. For decades, this was treated as legend, colorful local folklore, nothing that could be substantiated. The ROV footage suggests the legends may have been true. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the story that has not been fully released to the public. The research teams have shared the environmental data openly, the barrels, the contamination, the migration, but specific portions of the deep water footage have been withheld pending investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Washoe County Sheriff's Office. What members of the dive and ROV teams have described on background in conversations with reporters from regional outlets is that the surveys encountered what appear to be human remains in multiple locations along the deep basin. The cold has preserved them beyond what anyone expected. They are not skeletons. The soft tissue has been maintained by the near-freezing temperatures, the lack of oxygen, the absence of organisms that would normally consume remains. One operator, speaking to a Reno reporter, said only this: "I have a hard time sleeping after that shift. Let that land for a moment." We are not talking about archaeological finds. We are not talking about bones in mud. We are talking about people in clothes, in the postures they were in when they hit the water, held in suspended animation by the same chemistry that held the barrels, faces that, by every law of biology in a normal lake, should have been erased decades ago. They have not been erased. They have been waiting. Dating the remains is challenging without direct examination, which would require recovery operations that are logistically complex and legally sensitive. But the associated debris, clothing styles, personal effects, and vehicle models nearby suggest most date to the 1950s through the 1970s. That was the peak era of mob activity in the Tahoe region. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office has issued only a brief statement confirming that the footage is being reviewed and that the matter is active. But the implication is clear. Lake Tahoe's depth, which made it perfect for dumping industrial waste, also made it perfect for disposing of bodies. The same cold that preserved the barrels preserved the people. The same dark that hid the chemicals hid the victims. Cases that went cold 50 and 60 years ago because nobody could find the evidence. The evidence has been there the entire time. The reckoning nobody wants the question that officials, researchers, and residents are now grappling with is what to do about all of this. The environmental contamination is the most pressing concern. Heavy metals leaching into the water supply of a lake that feeds downstream communities, that supports a fishing industry that attracts millions of recreational users every year. This is not an abstract problem. It is a public health emergency unfolding in slow motion. But here is where the story gets impossible. Remediation is extraordinarily complex. The barrels lie at depths that are expensive and dangerous to work at. Disturbing them could accelerate the release of their contents rather than containing it. The scale, hundreds of barrels scattered across miles of lake bed, exceeds any previous cleanup effort in a natural water body in American history. Schlato has been candid about the dilemma. Some on his team advocate leaving the barrels in place and focusing on monitoring. The reckoning nobody wants the question that officials, researchers, and residents are now grappling with is what to do about all of this. The environmental contamination is the most pressing concern. Heavy metals leaching into the water supply of a lake that feeds downstream communities, that supports a fishing industry that attracts millions of recreational users every year. This is not an abstract problem. It is a public health emergency unfolding in slow motion. But here is where the story gets impossible. Remediation is extraordinarily complex. The barrels lie at depths that are expensive and dangerous to work at. Disturbing them could accelerate the release of their contents rather than containing it. The scale, hundreds of barrels scattered across miles of lake bed, exceeds any previous cleanup effort in a natural water body in American history. Schlato has been candid about the dilemma. Some on his team advocate leaving the barrels in place and focusing on monitoring. Pull a corroded drum off the bottom and you might cause the very release you are trying to prevent. Leave it down there and the leak continues, but slowly on a timeline measured in human generations. There is no clean answer. There is only the choice of which catastrophe to accept. Others argue that leaving known toxic waste in one of America's most iconic lakes is unacceptable. Full stop. Corrosion will continue. Leaks will worsen. The contamination will eventually reach levels that cannot be ignored. State and federal agencies, including the California State Water Resources Control Board and the Environmental Protection Agency Region 9 office, have formed working groups. Studies have been commissioned, funding has been requested, but the bureaucratic wheels turn slowly and the barrels keep leaking. The human remains present a different kind of problem. Recovery would yield evidence in cases that have been cold for 50 or 60 years. Witnesses are dead. Suspects are dead. The organizations that ordered the killings may no longer exist in recognizable form. Is it worth millions of dollars to recover victims whose killers killers can never be brought to justice? Is it worth the legal complexity, the media attention, the disruption to the carefully crafted image of Lake Tahoe as a pristine paradise? For the families of missing persons, people who disappeared in the Tahoe region decades ago, music, and were never found, the answer is obviously yes. Some of those families have waited lifetimes for closure. But for the tourism industry and the property owners whose land values depend on Tahoe's reputation, the calculation is more complicated. There is also the question of accountability. The industrial dumping was not done by anonymous individuals acting alone. It was done by companies, often with the tacit acceptance of local authorities. Records suggest that some officials actively facilitated it. Permits were granted that should not have been. Inspections were not conducted. Complaints were ignored. The system that was supposed to protect Lake Tahoe instead allowed it to become a dumping ground. Many of the individuals involved are long dead. Many of the companies no longer exist, but the institutional patterns that allowed this to happen are still with us. Lake Tahoe is not unique. What we are finding now in one lake is a preview of what we would find if we looked closely at any of them. The truth is out. The 2024 drought pulled back the curtain, but droughts are temporary. Water levels will eventually rise again. The exposed shoreline debris will slip back underwater. The deep contamination will continue to spread slowly and invisibly for decades or centuries to come. What was found will not be unfound. The knowledge exists now. The footage exists. The water samples exist. Colin West has the dive logs. Jeffrey Schladow has the lab results. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office has the deep water frames it will not yet release. The truth is out, leaked and re-uploaded and spread across the internet beyond any ability to suppress it. The tourists will keep coming. The casinos will keep operating. The brochures will keep describing Lake Tahoe as one of the last pristine places in America. The economy of the region depends on maintaining that image, even if the image is a lie. But the remotely operated vehicles documented what is really at the bottom. The researchers analyzed what is really in the water. For 70 years, depth was protection. Darkness was concealment. The impossibility of seeing the bottom was assurance that the bottom would never be seen. Technology changed that calculation. The drought accelerated the reckoning. And now everyone knows what was hiding in the clearest water in America. Hundreds of barrels of toxic waste leaching heavy metals into the water supply. Dozens of vehicles dumped with their fluids still inside. And the preserved remains of people who disappeared into the lake and were never supposed to be found. Lake Tahoe is still beautiful. The surface still sparkles in the Sierra Nevada sun. The clarity still amazes visitors who have never seen water so transparent. But beneath that surface, in the darkness at 1,600 feet, the truth waits. It has been waiting for 70 years. And now that it has been found, nothing will ever make it disappear again. Every photograph of Lake Tahoe you have ever seen, every postcard, every drone shot in a tourism ad, every blue sparkling moment ever captured from the shoreline, all of it is real. The lake really is that beautiful. The water really is that clear. But the picture is incomplete. The picture stops at the surface. And what the picture leaves out, what nobody photographed for 70 long years, is the only part that matters now. So here is what I want to know from you. If you were the one running the cleanup, would you raise the barrels and risk a chemical disaster on the way up? Or leave them down there and hope the corrosion holds for another generation? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if Lake Tahoe rattled you, wait until you see what divers found inside an abandoned reservoir in Nevada last spring. That video is up next. Click it before the lake claims another secret.